I was standing in a wet market in Cagayan de Oro, holding a pineapple that cost me 20 pesos, when something shifted in my chest. Not because of the pineapple. Not because the woman selling it had smiled at me like I was a neighbor she'd known for years. It shifted because I could suddenly remember, very clearly, the last time I had stood in a grocery store back in Ontario and paid $4.89 for a pineapple that tasted like cardboard wrapped in yellow skin. I remember putting it in my cart without thinking twice, because that's what you do. That's what I did for 62 years. You just keep going. You don't stop to ask whether any of it makes sense. My name is Frank. I'm 64 years old. I spent most of my working life as a project coordinator for a construction firm outside of Hamilton. My wife, Margaret, worked as an administrative assistant at a dental office for over 20 years. We raised 2 kids in a semi-detached house in a neighborhood that used to be affordable. We weren't wealthy. We weren't struggling. We were somewhere in the middle, that place Canadians used to call comfortable. And we spent most of our lives assuming that comfortable was something you could count on. I want to tell you how we ended up in the Philippines. But to explain that, I have to start somewhere that might surprise you. I have to start with a grocery receipt. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February. One of those Hamilton Februaries where the wind comes off the lake and cuts straight through you before you even make it from the car to the front door. I had gone to the grocery store for what I thought was a fairly ordinary shop. Nothing special, nothing extravagant. Milk, bread, chicken thighs, a bag of carrots, some cheddar, a box of crackers, a few tins of soup, cereal for the week. The kind of cart you push without paying attention because you've filled it the same way for 30 years. The total came to $312. I stood at the checkout and looked at the screen for a moment longer than I should have. The cashier was already asking if I wanted my receipt. I said yes. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. I walked out to the parking lot, loaded the bags into the back of the car, and then I sat in the driver's seat for a minute without starting the engine. $312. For a Tuesday shop. For 2 people. Our kids were grown. Our son, Andrew, had moved to Calgary a few years before. Our daughter, Claire, lived about 40 minutes away with her husband and our 2 grandkids. It was just Margaret and me. Just the 2 of us rattling around in a house that had started to feel both too big and too expensive at the same time. I didn't say anything about the receipt when I got home. I put the groceries away, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table doing what I always did when something was bothering me. I started doing the math. I went back through 3 months of grocery receipts. Some I had to pull up on the bank statement because I'd tapped my card and thrown the paper away. What I found didn't make me feel better. We were spending, on average, somewhere between $1,100 and $1,300 a month on groceries alone. Not dining out, not takeaway, just the supermarket. Just food we were bringing home and cooking ourselves. I knew costs had gone up. Everyone in Canada knew that. You couldn't have a conversation at a hardware store or a hockey rink without someone mentioning it. But I hadn't been adding it up. I had been absorbing it the way you absorb most things when you're busy, quietly, without realizing how much it's actually costing you. I showed Margaret the numbers that evening after dinner. She looked at the paper, then looked at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. She said, "That can't be right." I said, "I checked it 3 times. She picked up the paper and looked at it again. Then she set it down and walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking out at the backyard. It was dark, and there was nothing to see but snow and the shape of the cedar hedge we'd planted 20 years ago. Then she said quietly, "What are we doing wrong?" And I didn't have an answer, because I didn't think we were doing anything wrong. We weren't buying organic everything. We weren't shopping at the expensive specialty stores. We were doing what we had always done. The same cart, the same store, the same routine. The prices had simply stopped making sense. That was the first evening I started wondering whether the version of life we had been living, the version we'd always assumed was the stable, sensible, responsible one, was actually as solid as we'd always believed it was. I didn't act on it. Not yet. I did what most people do. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself inflation would settle. I told myself that every generation feels like things are getting harder, and most of the time they find a way through. I believed that for about 4 more months. Then our property tax bill arrived. Then our home insurance renewal came in at a number that made me read the page twice. Then the grocery receipts kept coming in at $300 and something every single week. And I stopped telling myself it was temporary, because it clearly wasn't. Margaret and I had been talking for a while about what we wanted retirement to look like. Nothing unusual in that. You get into your 60s and you start having those conversations. We had a modest RRSP. We had CPP coming in a few years. We had the house. On paper, it looked manageable. In practice, every time I sat down to run the numbers for what retirement would actually cost us in Hamilton, the picture got a little less comfortable. The house needed a new roof. We had put it off for 2 years. The quote we got was $42,000. We stood in the kitchen looking at that quote, the way you look at a bill that doesn't seem real, and I remember thinking, this is the 3rd time this year I've stood in this kitchen, looking at a number I can't quite believe. I started sleeping worse. Not dramatically. Nothing I would have called a crisis. But there was a low, persistent kind of hum in the back of my mind that had started following me around. The kind of feeling where you're sitting at dinner and you're fine, you're talking, you're laughing, and then in a quiet moment it drifts back. What happens if the furnace goes? What happens when the car needs replacing? What happens when the CPP doesn't cover what we thought it would cover? What does the next 15 years actually look like? I didn't bring it up with Margaret right away because I didn't want to alarm her. But one evening, she was the one who brought it up. We were watching television, and she turned the volume down and said, "Frank, do you ever think about whether we're actually going to be all right?" I said, "Yes, fairly often lately." She nodded, like that was the answer she'd been expecting. We sat there a while. Then she said, "I've been watching some videos about people who retired abroad." She said it carefully, like she was testing whether I would laugh. I didn't laugh. I asked her to show me. The first video she played was about a couple from British Columbia who had retired to Portugal. The second was about a man from Alberta living in Mexico. The third was a family who had moved to the Philippines and were talking about their monthly budget. I almost stopped paying attention at that point, because the Philippines hadn't been anywhere near my thinking. But the man in the video was talking about his grocery bill. He said they were spending the equivalent of about 250 Canadian dollars a month on food for 2 adults. I looked at Margaret. She looked at me. I said, "Play that again." She played it again. $250 a month for food for 2 people. We had been spending that in a single week. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it wasn't some sudden dramatic decision. It wasn't a moment where we looked at each other and said, "Right, we're moving to the Philippines." It was slower than that. It was more confused than that. It was me lying awake at 2 in the morning thinking, "That can't possibly be right," followed by me getting up and spending an hour reading, followed by me finding out that it actually could be right depending on where you lived and how you lived. Over the next few weeks, I started watching more videos, reading expat forums, looking at cost of living comparisons, looking specifically at cities, not just the Philippines as a concept, but actual places. Cebu, Davao, Dumaguete, Cagayan de Oro. Margaret thought I was going down a rabbit hole, which, to be fair, I was. But it was the most engaged I'd felt about the future in a long time. Not anxious about it, actually interested in it. One Saturday morning, Margaret came into the kitchen and found me at the table with my laptop and 3 tabs open comparing rental prices in different Philippine cities. She said, "You're serious about this?" I said, "I'm seriously considering it. There's a difference." She sat down across from me and looked at the screen. She asked me to explain what I was looking at. So I did. I showed her the rental prices for a decent two-bedroom apartment in Cagayan de Oro, around 12 to 15,000 pesos a month, which worked out to roughly 300 Canadian dollars. I showed her the grocery comparisons. I showed her a forum thread where expats were talking about their full monthly budgets, including rent, food, utilities, health costs. The numbers were consistent. A couple living modestly but comfortably in a mid-sized Philippine city could manage on somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 Canadian dollars a month. Not in poverty, not in luxury. Comfortably. I asked Margaret to sit with the idea for a while, not to decide anything, just to sit with it. She said she would. Then she said, "You know your sister is going to think we've completely lost it." I said, "My sister thought we'd lost it when we bought the second car." That made her laugh, and something about her laughing made the whole thing feel slightly more possible than it had 5 minutes before. The next 2 months were strange. We didn't tell anyone. It was still just a conversation between the two of us, something we took out and examined at the kitchen table every few days, and then put away again. We read everything we could find. We watched people talking about the Philippines, people who loved it, people who hated it, people who had tried it and come back, people who had gone and never wanted to leave. We tried to read between the lines, tried to figure out who was painting an accurate picture and who was selling a fantasy. What seemed consistent across almost all of it was this: life was different, not perfect, not without frustration, not without the occasional day when you missed home in a way that caught you off guard, but different. And different for us at that point in our lives was starting to sound like exactly what we needed. The questions we hadn't been able to answer in Hamilton. Where is the money going? Will we have enough? What does the next 15 years actually look like? Started to feel like questions that might have answers somewhere else. I called Andrew one evening. He lives in Calgary, works in oil and gas, practical man, not given to flights of fancy. I expected him to push back hard. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, honestly, if the numbers work, why wouldn't you?" I hadn't expected that. I called Claire next. She was more emotional about it. Not against it, but she started talking about the grandkids and holidays and what Christmas would look like, and I had to let her work through that on her own for a while. Eventually she said, "If this is what makes you and Mum happy, then I want it for you. But you have to promise to come back for Christmas." I said I'd do my best. Outside the family, the reactions were more mixed. Our next-door neighbor, Doug, said it was the bravest thing he'd ever heard. Our friend Elaine, who had known Margaret since university, said she thought we were making a mistake. A colleague of mine from the old job sent me a lengthy email with articles about safety concerns and humidity, and the difficulty of accessing specialists if your health declined. I read the email carefully and I appreciated that he'd sent it. But most of what he said were concerns I had already spent considerable time researching. The truth was, we weren't naive about the challenges. You can't read that many expat forums without coming away with a realistic picture. The heat is real. The typhoon season is real. The fact that foreigners cannot own freehold land in the Philippines is real. You rent or you buy a condo unit under certain conditions, but you don't own land the way you own it in Canada. The healthcare system has limitations, which is why we looked carefully at expat health insurance options and why we set aside a contingency fund before we went. The bureaucracy around visas can be slow and occasionally frustrating. We knew all of that. We went anyway. The decision happened on an evening in October. We had been going back and forth for months, and I think both of us were tired of the in-between state. Margaret and I were sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd looked at the grocery receipts and the property tax bill and the roofing quote, and she said, "Frank, if we don't do this now, I think we never will." I knew she was right. I said, "Then let's do it." She looked at me for a moment, and I could see she was both relieved and terrified, which was exactly how I felt. What followed was several months of the most complicated logistics I had ever managed. And I say that as someone who spent decades coordinating construction projects. Sorting out what to do with the house we decided to sell, which was its own emotional ordeal. Working out what to keep, what to ship, what to give to Andrew and Claire, what to donate, what to throw away. You don't realize how much of your identity is tied up in the contents of a house until you start putting it into boxes. There was one evening, I remember this clearly, when I was packing up the shelves in my home office, and I came across a box of photos. Old ones from when Andrew and Claire were young. Birthday parties, camping trips. That summer we rented a cottage on Lake Huron. I sat on the floor with the box in my lap for a long time. I wasn't second-guessing the decision, but I was feeling the weight of it in a way that hadn't fully registered before. We were leaving. Not on holiday, not for a year. We were leaving, and everything that had been our life here was going to become the life we used to have. That's a different feeling than I'd expected it to be. The night before we flew out, we stayed at Claire's. She made dinner, nothing fancy, just a roast and vegetables, the kind of meal she makes when she wants things to feel normal. After we ate, we sat in her living room and the grandkids climbed on me the way they always do, all elbows and questions, and I thought, this is the part that will be hard, not the flight, not the apartment in a new city. But I also thought, this is exactly the kind of thing you can't let stop you from living. Because if you let it stop you, you end up sitting in a house in Hamilton, watching the grocery bills go up, and the roof getting older, and the retirement savings looking a little smaller every year, and you never find out what else might have been possible. We landed in Cagayan de Oro on a Thursday afternoon in early March. The first thing that hit me wasn't the heat, though the heat was real. It was the sound. People everywhere, motors and voices, and the particular kind of organized chaos that I later learned is just how this city moves. After a Canadian February, it was almost disorienting, in the best possible way. The first few weeks felt surreal. Everything was new. Orienting ourselves to the neighborhood, figuring out where to buy things, learning which markets had the freshest produce, and at what time of day. I caught myself comparing everything to home, which I think is inevitable. You land somewhere new, and your brain immediately reaches for the familiar as a reference point. But gradually, that stopped happening so much. There's a market about 15 minutes from where we live. Not a big supermarket with fluorescent lighting and loyalty card scanners. A wet market, the kind where the vegetables are piled on wooden tables, and the vendors know the regulars, and the fish comes in fresh in the morning. Margaret started going 2 or 3 times a week. I started going with her. I want to describe what it's like, because it's one of those things that sounds small when you try to put it into words but doesn't feel small when you're standing there. The tomatoes are misshapen, and some of them are a little dirty, and they are the best tomatoes I've eaten in 30 years. The chicken is fresh in a way that supermarket chicken in Canada hasn't been for a very long time. Everything is loud and alive and slightly chaotic. And you come home with more food than you planned to buy for less money than you expected to spend. And you cook dinner, and the kitchen smells like something is actually happening in it. Our grocery bill, that first full month, came to just under 9,000 pesos. At the exchange rate at the time, that was roughly 220 Canadian dollars. I took a photo of the receipt and sent it to Andrew. He sent back a single message. "Dad, come on." I sent him a photo of the chicken we'd made for dinner. He didn't respond for a while. When he did, he said, "All right, I need to come visit." The cost of living overall was consistent with what I'd researched. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of the city, furnished with air conditioning and a decent internet connection, for 14,000 pesos a month, around 340 Canadian dollars. Our utilities ran about 2,000 pesos. Eating out occasionally added perhaps another 3,000 or 4,000 pesos between us for the month. We budgeted carefully and we found that we could live well, not extravagantly, but genuinely well, on around 55,000 to 65,000 pesos a month, depending on the month. That worked out to roughly 1,500 Canadian dollars, sometimes a little more. In Hamilton, that same money had felt like it was disappearing before we'd even had a chance to blink. I want to be honest about the hard parts too, because I think people deserve honesty more than they deserve a fantasy. The heat takes adjustment. I grew up in Ontario winters, and I'd spent 40 years treating summer as a brief seasonal gift. In Cagayan de Oro, the heat doesn't relent in the same way. We learn to move differently. Slower mornings, staying inside during the hottest part of the afternoon, adapting our whole rhythm to the climate rather than fighting it. There were days when I missed things. Not big things, always. Specific things. The smell of a hockey rink, a weekend in Algonquin Park, being able to call Claire and have her show up an hour later. Tim Hortons, honestly, which I know sounds ridiculous, but sometimes you just want something that tastes exactly like it always has. The visa situation required attention. Canada has no specific retirement visa arrangement with the Philippines, so we looked at the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, which requires a deposit with the Philippine Retirement Authority and provides a fairly stable long-term residency option for retirees over 50. It wasn't complicated, but it required paperwork and patience and following up more than once. That's just part of it. Healthcare was something we thought about carefully before going and continued to think about after arriving. We maintain private expat health insurance. We've had a couple of minor things come up, nothing serious, and we've found the private hospitals in the city to be more than adequate for routine care. For anything major, we would need to make a decision about whether to travel. And we've accepted that as part of the reality of where we live. Most expats we've spoken to have done the same calculation and reached the same conclusion. None of this is perfect. I want to say that clearly, because I think people sometimes watch videos about expat life and expect the narrator to say it's all sunshine and fresh pineapple, and when reality turns out to be more complicated, they feel misled. Life is complicated everywhere. The Philippines is not an exception to that. What I can say is this. About 7 months after we arrived, I was sitting on the small balcony outside our apartment. Early morning, before the city fully woke up, I had a cup of coffee. Margaret was still asleep. It was already warm, but there was a bit of a breeze moving through, and I could hear birds I hadn't learned the names of yet, and somewhere down the street, somebody was starting a motorbike. I sat there and I realized something. I wasn't doing the math. I wasn't running numbers in my head. I wasn't calculating what the furnace might cost, or how many more years the roof had left, or whether the CPP was going to be enough. I was just sitting there, drinking my coffee, listening to the morning. For a man who had spent the better part of 3 years lying awake calculating, that felt like something worth noticing. The move, when I thought back on it, had never really been about the groceries. The groceries were what got my attention. They were the thing that finally made the numbers undeniable. But what we were actually chasing wasn't cheap food. It was the feeling I was having right then on that balcony. A life that had room in it. A life where the numbers worked, and the days didn't feel like they were constantly outrunning us. Margaret came out with her own coffee a little while later and sat down beside me. We didn't say much. We watched the street below start to fill up. A woman set out vegetables on a little cart. A group of school children walked past in uniforms. A cat appeared on the wall across the way and regarded us with complete indifference. Margaret said, "Eventually, I think this was the right call." I said, "I think so too." And I meant it. Not as the kind of thing you say to reassure yourself when you're still not sure. I meant it the way you mean something when you've had enough time and enough ordinary mornings to know that it's true. Claire came to visit us in November with the grandkids. She spent 2 weeks. By the end of the first week, she had stopped talking about missing home and started asking questions about neighborhoods and schools, and what the cost of living was like. I didn't say anything about that. I just answered her questions. Andrew came in January. He stayed 10 days. On his last evening, he sat on the balcony where I'd had that realization 7 months earlier, and he said, "Dad, I get it now. I actually get it. I didn't need him to, but I was glad he did." If you're reading this in Canada, and you're doing the same mental arithmetic I was doing, running the grocery bills, and the property taxes, and the insurance premiums, and the retirement calculations, and finding that the numbers keep getting harder to make work, I'm not going to tell you that moving to the Philippines is the answer for every person, because it isn't. Every situation is different. Every family has different needs, different health considerations, different ties that are harder to leave than others. But I will tell you this. For the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of what the next 15 years look like, not because the Philippines is perfect, not because every problem disappeared when we got off the plane, but because we stopped waiting for something to change on its own, and we went and changed it ourselves. Sometimes that's the only way forward. Not the easy way, not the obvious way, just the one that actually moves you somewhere new. I was standing in a market in Cagayan de Oro, holding a pineapple that cost me 20 pesos, and something shifted. It took me 64 years and a grocery receipt from a Hamilton supermarket to get me there. But I got there, and I'm glad we did.